An orchid lies shattered in Wolfe's glass-domed sanctuary, a violation too precise to be chance, too personal to be ignored. What secret was crushed with its petals, and who dared cross that line? Welcome to Sayers and Secrets. Do you favor the golden age of mysteries or tales closer to our own time? Share in the comments. Now steady your thoughts, for truth often hides in the smallest of clues. I'll say this much for mornings at the brownstone. They're predictable, which is why this one stuck in my craw. I came down to the dining room expecting Fritz's usual symphony, coffee, eggs, and a scent of orchids hitching a ride on the air from the plant rooms. Instead, I found Fritz standing frozen in the doorway, balancing a tray like it was a ticking bomb. And worse, behind him, a voice that didn't belong. "Something's broken," Fritz muttered, shifting like he was deciding whether to serve breakfast or read last rites. "Yeah?" I stepped past him and saw it. A clay pot in Wolfe's orchid room, scattered across the polished floor, dirt everywhere, roots dangling, petals splayed like someone had staged a funeral for a flower. One flower, a rare orchid, judging by the way Fritz looked like he might faint. "Pfui!" Wolfe's voice floated in from his office. He hadn't even bothered to raise the volume. "An accident. Flowers fall. Pots break." "Sure," I said, stooping to study the mess. "Except the windows latched from the inside, and unless Fritz has taken to juggling orchids in his spare time, somebody had to knock it over." Fritz stiffened. "I would never—" "Relax," I told him. "If you start crying, Wolfe will banish you to the pantry for indecent display of emotion." That earned me Wolfe's growl from the office. "Archie, bring me my breakfast, and less chatter." I left Fritz to sweep up what looked like a botanical homicide and ferried Wolfe his eggs and beer. He was already in his chair, lips pursed, the day's stack of mail unopened on the desk beside him. He glanced up once, which in Wolf speak is equivalent to a double take. "You're unusually ruffled." "Maybe because orchids don't usually self-destruct before coffee." I set the tray down. "And you might want to look sharp. We've got company." The bell rang right on cue. Fritz scurried to answer, dust still clinging to his cuffs. A man stepped in, bringing with him a smell of rain and tobacco. He was tall, lean, and looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. His hat was damp, his overcoat wrinkled, and his eyes kept doing laps around the room like he was checking exits. I need to see Mr. Wolfe," he said, voice low, urgent. Wolfe didn't even flinch. "You're seeing him?" He plucked at a slice of toast. "Sit. State your business." The man obeyed, perching like the chair had nails in it. "My name is Ansel Frobisher, and I believe someone is trying to kill me." I've heard plenty of entrance lines, but that one beat my usual morning crossword. Wolfe buttered his toast as though Frobisher had announced he'd misplaced his umbrella. "You believe," Wolfe repeated. "That is nebulous. Conviction requires evidence." Frobisher leaned forward. "I have evidence, threats, notes slipped under my door. My car tires slashed, and now—" He glanced toward the orchid room. "That. I believe it was a message." Wolfe lifted an eyebrow. "A message conveyed by botanical vandalism." "Not just any plant," Frobisher said, pulling a photograph from his coat. He slid it across the desk. A black and white shot of an orchid. Delicate, strange, with spotted petals like bruises. "It's called Paphiopedilum insigne. My late wife cultivated them. She died 2 years ago. This bloom was hers." I whistled. "So somebody breaks into our house to whack an orchid, and you think it's aimed at you?" "I don't think." His voice cracked, then steadied. "I know, because whoever did it left this." He placed a folded note on the desk. Wolfe eyed it like a fly on his beer glass. I picked it up and read aloud. "One orchid down. The next is you." I looked at Wolfe. Even he couldn't brush off handwriting on our home turf. He scowled, thick brows knitting. "Mr. Frobisher," he said slowly, This intrusion is intolerable. Archie, who entered this house this morning? No one, I said, not unless burglars have learned to turn invisible. Wolfe tapped his fingers on the arm of his chair. Phooey, a trespasser has violated my sanctuary. He lifted his eyes to Frobisher. This insult is more pressing than your fears. Explain yourself. Who would link your fate with an orchid? Frobisher swallowed. My wife left behind more than flowers. She left secrets. People would kill to keep them buried. That word, kill, hung in the air like smoke. Fritz flinched. Wolfe closed his eyes as if savoring the taste of a new puzzle. You're tedious, Mr. Frobisher, Wolfe said at last. But intriguing. You shall leave the note. Archie will inquire. Meanwhile, you will refrain from dramatics. I cannot abide hysteria. Frobisher's hands trembled as he rose. If you refuse, I refuse nothing yet. Wolfe's eyelids snapped open. But I warn you, should you be lying, you will regret entering this house. The man stiffened, nodded, and let Fritz escort him out. I turned back to Wolfe. Well, congratulations. You've got yourself a client, whether you like it or not. Phooey, Wolfe speared an egg. I have an annoyance, which you will now pursue. I picked up the folded note again, studying the jagged scrawl. Whoever left it knew how to make a point. I tucked it into my pocket. From the orchid room, Fritz's broom clattered to the floor. His voice rose, shrill. Mr. Wolfe, another one. We hurried in. On the work table lay a second orchid pot, untouched, its petals intact, except for a single bloom, sliced clean across the stem, as if by a razor. And on the table beside it, something new. A small envelope addressed in the same hand as the note. I reached for it, but Wolfe's voice cracked like a whip. Do not touch. The room went silent, save for the sound of rain tapping against the glass. Fritz's gasp still hung in the air when I crouched to get a closer look at the envelope. Cream-colored, fine texture, the kind that doesn't come in a 5-and-dime stationery set. The handwriting matched the note tucked in my pocket. Slanted, quick strokes, like the writer had no patience for the niceties of penmanship. Wolfe had planted himself in the doorway, arms folded, looking as though the very sight of the thing had personally insulted him. Archie. His voice had that warning hum, the one that said the next sound out of me had better not be an excuse. Bring it in. Take care. You will employ a handkerchief. I fished one out, wrapped the envelope as though it were nitroglycerin, and carried it to Wolfe's desk. He didn't touch it, just stared at it as though he could peel away the contents with sheer disdain. Finally, he flicked 2 fingers. Open it. I slit the flap carefully and slid out a single folded sheet. The same ink, the same restless hand. You cannot protect him. His roots are rotten. The orchid will not be the last. Wolfe shut his eyes, lips compressing. Fritz crossed himself, which I hadn't seen him do since the butcher tried to pass off veal as pork 3 years back. Well, I said, laying the page flat, our mystery pen pal has a flair for metaphor. Rotten roots, dying orchids, next up the man himself. He's practically drawn us a map. Phooey. Wolfe opened his eyes again, dark and flat. The scrawl of a coward. Meaning is buried beneath melodrama. But it confirms one point. And what's that? That our house has been entered. I didn't argue. The brownstone was Wolfe's castle, and if a mouse so much as sneezed inside its walls without his permission, he'd call it treachery. This was more than a sneeze. Someone had come in, strolled past a locked window, left a note, and manhandled orchids Wolfe prized above most of the human race. That meant we weren't dealing with a prank. This was war. Do I take it, I asked, that we're officially on Frobisher's payroll? You will inform Mr. Frobisher that he has engaged my attention for the present. I will consider terms once I know if his hysteria conceals fact or fabrication. For now, your legs and eyes are required. Fetch Mr. Panzer. That meant Saul Panzer, top freelance detective and the one man in New York who could tail his own shadow without it noticing. If Wolfe was calling him in before lunch, then he considered the situation less than tolerable. Right away, I said. But I didn't get the chance. The doorbell buzzed again. This time, Fritz all but bolted to answer, desperate for a task that didn't involve funerals for flowers. A woman's voice drifted in from the vestibule. Clear, crisp, a little too composed. A moment later, Fritz ushered her in. She was tall, dark-haired, dressed in grey silk with gloves that hadn't seen the inside of a department store bargain bin. Her eyes swept the room like she was calculating odds. She stopped when she saw the envelope lying open on Wolfe's desk. "So it's true," she said softly. "He came here." Wolfe's brows rose. "You are?" "Clara Frobisher, Ansel's sister-in-law, or widow-in-law if you prefer." Her smile had no warmth. I suppose my timing is impeccable. I stepped closer, filing away details. A faint scent of jasmine, the cool confidence of a woman used to talking down salesmen and senators alike, and a small, sharp diamond on her left hand that could have drawn blood if you weren't careful. "Your husband's brother?" Wolfe asked. "My sister's husband," she corrected smoothly. "Helen. She was Ansel's wife." "Ah." Wolfe settled deeper into his chair. "And why are you here, madam?" She hesitated, eyes flicking once more to the letter. "Because Ansel is a fool, and fools attract danger." I decided to cut in before Wolfe strangled her with silence. "Funny, Mrs. Frobisher, that you'd show up just after your brother-in-law swore someone was trying to kill him. Coincidence, or did you smell the smoke before the fire started?" Her lips curved. "Archie Goodwin, isn't it?" "Yes, I've heard of you." "No, not coincidence. I found something last night, a ledger. My sister's handwriting. Notes about transactions, money, unusual deposits. Things Ansel never explained. I thought he might be hiding them. Instead, it seems the danger found you." Ledger. That word always perks Wolfe up more than beer delivery. He leaned forward an inch, which in his vocabulary was the equivalent of a gasp. "Where is this ledger?" "I didn't bring it," she said evenly. "Not until I know whom I can trust." The room went very still. Wolfe's gaze bored into her, heavy as a hammer. She didn't flinch. I said, "Trust us or not, lady. Somebody just trashed Wolfe's orchids and left us love notes about rotting roots. You don't get to play coy with props." "I'll decide what I get to play." She rose, smoothing her gloves. "I only came to warn you that Ansel's story is not complete. If he's hiding behind you, be prepared for what follows. Helen kept secrets, and secrets have a way of devouring the men who think they own them." She turned, Fritz scuttling to show her out, leaving the faint trail of perfume behind. I looked at Wolfe. "So now we've got a weeping widower, a ledger, threats written by a poet with a grudge, and your orchids paying the price. What's next?" Wolfe's eyes closed. His lips moved like he was savoring a sip of fine sherry. "Next, Archie, you will accompany Mr. Frobisher home. Retrieve this ledger. Bring it to me without delay. Meanwhile, Saul will shadow our visitor. I do not tolerate enigmas parading in silk." That was that. When Wolfe gave orders with his eyes closed, it meant the plan was already stitched together. I pocketed the second note, grabbed my hat, and went for the door. The sky outside was still leaking rain, streets shining like fresh ink. A cab took me uptown to Ansel Frobisher's address, a respectable stone apartment building with brass rails polished enough to blind a man. Frobisher himself met me in the hall, looking worse than he had that morning, tie crooked, hands trembling. "You saw it?" he asked, pulling me inside. "The second note?" "Yeah, and it doesn't win points for subtlety. Let's see this ledger your sister-in-law mentioned." His face drained. "Ledger? What ledger?" That was when the hall buzzer sounded again. Frobisher flinched. I moved to the peephole. A man in a tan raincoat stood outside, hat brim low, gloved hand tapping a package against his leg. He looked patient. Too patient. I muttered, "Looks like delivery day." Frobisher's voice cracked. "I didn't order anything." No surprise there. The man knocked once, twice, then slid the package through the slot and vanished down the stairs before I could wrench the door open. I stooped. Brown paper parcel, string tied neat, no label. Frobisher was shaking so bad I thought he'd rattle his teeth loose. I picked it up, held it to my ear. Silent. No ticking. Still, it had the kind of weight you don't trust. "Archie," Frobisher whispered. "Don't." I tore the string. Inside, under layers of newspaper, lay something that made my skin crawl. Another orchid bloom, clean cut, and beneath it, a slip of paper. This one read, "The roots rot faster than you think." I folded it, pocketed it, and told Frobisher to sit tight. Wolfe was going to love this. When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was waiting, beer in hand, expression set in stone. I laid the orchid on his desk. He studied it, then looked up at me. "This," he said, voice heavy, "is no longer an annoyance. It is an abomination." And with that, he rang for Fritz, ordered the phone, and told me to fetch Saul Panzer. Because the game, whether Wolfe liked it or not, had just walked straight into his orchid rooms and laid its roots at his feet. Wolfe didn't touch the bloom I'd laid on his desk. He gave it the kind of look you'd reserve for a cockroach that had figured out how to spell its own name, then set down his beer with a finality that said Fritz had better get another one ready. He barked Saul's name again as if sheer repetition would conjure him through the wall, then tilted his head toward me. "You were followed." "No, I wasn't," I said, dropping into the red leather chair. Unless the guy trailing me was wearing the kind of cloak they only sell in fairy tales. I checked. "Phooey. You were followed. The package was not coincidental. Whoever left it knew you would carry it here." I let that sink in. It wasn't impossible. The man in the tan raincoat could have shadowed me from Frobisher's building, used the cab's reflection to keep a safe distance, and strolled off once he knew I'd delivered the goods. The brownstone might as well have a target painted on the roof. The doorbell rang again, sharp, quick. Fritz had just returned from the kitchen, and his sigh could have powered a turbine. He shuffled off, and when he opened up, I caught the sound of rain-soaked shoes and a mutter of impatience. Saul Panzer stepped in, quiet as ever, trench coat buttoned high, hat brim dripping. His eyes flicked from the orchid to Wolfe's expression, and he didn't bother asking questions. "You've got work," Wolfe said. "You will find Clara Frobisher. Follow her. Learn whom she meets, where and why. Archie will provide particulars." Saul gave me a look. I gave him the short version about silk, gloves, and the ledger she hadn't delivered. He nodded once, turned, and left without a word. Efficiency in shoe leather. When the door shut, Wolfe pushed himself an inch deeper into his chair and gestured at the pile of notes. "Archie. Correlations." I pulled out my notebook. "We've got one husband shaking in his boots, one widow-in-law who talks like she's auditioning for Lady Macbeth, a ledger nobody's seen, and orchids being murdered one by one with notes attached. If I were grading it, I'd give the writer points for persistence and flunk him on subtlety." "The emphasis," Wolfe said, "is not on subtlety. It is on repetition, the orchid motif, the metaphor of rot, the focus on the late Mrs. Frobisher. This is not random malice, it is message." "Message received, except nobody signed it." "They will," Wolfe murmured. "Compulsion demands signature. The human need to be recognized. For now, you will escort Mr. Frobisher here. I wish to observe his reaction to the second note." I made the call, and Frobisher arrived half an hour later, collar turned up against the rain. He looked worse, if that was possible. Wolfe didn't greet him. He simply pointed to the bloom on the desk. Frobisher's face crumpled like tissue. "They won't stop," he whispered. "Not until—" He cut himself short, glancing at me, then at Wolfe. "Until what?" Wolfe pressed. "Until the truth stays buried." I barked out a laugh. "You've got a funny way of burying things, pal. Somebody out there is digging like a terrier, and all you're doing is standing on the mound pretending it's solid ground." Frobisher's hands shook. "You don't understand." Wolfe rumbled low. "Then enlighten us. Whose secrets does this ledger contain?" "I never saw it," he insisted. "Helen kept her own affairs. I told Clara I wanted nothing to do with it. Yet you are the target." His silence was as loud as a shout. Wolfe drummed his fingers once on the armrest, then closed his eyes, dismissing him. That left me to escort Frobisher out and tell him to wait for a call. He looked like he wanted to bolt, but Wolfe's office has a gravity of its own. Men don't leave faster than Wolfe permits. When I came back, Wolfe was frowning at his beer as if it had misbehaved. "He dissembles," he said, "yet fear is genuine. He knows more than he admits. The pressure will increase. We will let it." That was Wolfe's way of saying we were in for another delivery or another note before the day was out. He wasn't wrong. Around 9 that evening, the phone rang. Fritz answered, then tiptoed in with a face that belonged in a wax museum. "Mr. Goodwin, it is the police." I took it, and Kramer's growl came through the line before I even spoke. "Goodwin, I hope to hell you and Wolfe aren't mixed up in this. Depends on what this is." "A body, found in Riverside Park. Male, mid-30s, strangled. Guess what was pinned to his coat?" I didn't have to guess. "An orchid. You win a cigar. You and Wolfe better keep your noses clean, or I'll make your lives miserable." He slammed down the phone. I turned. Wolfe's eyes were open, sharp as razors. "Well," I told him. He let out a sound that was neither word nor grunt, then pushed himself upright enough to reach the phone. "Archie, you will fetch Inspector Kramer at once. Bring him here." "Sure," I said. "Shall I bring the body too?" He glared, which was answer enough. Kramer stomped in an hour later, wet coat smelling like a swamp, eyes already narrowed. He spotted the orchids, the notes on Wolfe's desk, and swore under his breath. "So it is you, every damn time." Wolfe ignored him. "Describe the deceased." "Name's Gerald Fane," Kramer said grudgingly. "Unemployed, minor record, nothing that makes sense. But the orchid, why the hell an orchid?" Wolfe leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Because it is not about Fane. He is instrument, not subject. The true axis is the late Mrs. Frobisher. The symbolism is hers. These are reprisals, not statements." Kramer glared. "You talk like a crossword puzzle." "Spell it out." "Not yet." Wolfe closed his eyes again. "Not until I have the ledger. Until then, Archie will discover why Mr. Fane was chosen. Begin with connections to the Frobisher family." That was my cue. I saw Kramer out before he could chew the furniture, then called Lon Cohen at the Gazette. Lon always had a nose in somebody's dirty laundry. Sure enough, he came back with something by midnight. Gerald Fane had been seen, more than once, in the company of a woman answering Clara Frobisher's description. When I relayed that, Wolfe's lips curled in satisfaction. "Excellent. Saul will have details soon. We are near the marrow. Archie, you will sleep. Tomorrow, we press." I didn't argue. By then, the brownstone felt like a pressure cooker ready to blow its lid, and Wolfe had that look he gets when he knows the answer but won't share it until the timing's ripe. I left him staring at the severed bloom on his desk, as if by will alone he could force the petals to tell him the name of a killer. I didn't get much sleep, not because Wolfe had me working late, but because I knew damn well he'd spend half the night piecing together clues in his head without sharing a syllable of it. That's his style, leave Archie out of the loop until the punchline's ready, then spring it with all the drama of a curtain drop. By the time morning rolled around, Fritz's coffee hadn't even cooled before Saul rang the bell. He came in dripping wet again, hat under his arm, and looked at Wolfe with his usual calm face, the kind that says the news is bad but not unexpected. Clara Frobisher met with Gerald Fane 3 times in the last month, Saul reported, voice even. First at a hotel bar, second at a lawyer's office downtown, third last week at her apartment. No disguises, no attempt to keep it quiet. Wolfe's eyes opened a sliver wider, which from him was like an area. She invited suspicion, curious. Saul continued. Yesterday evening, after leaving here, she went to a private banking house on Madison. She entered with a satchel. She left without it. Half an hour later, Fane was spotted leaving the same building. Less than 3 hours after that, he was dead in Riverside Park. That tidbit perked even me up. So Clara hands Fane something, and later he ends up with an orchid pinned to him. Doesn't take Wolfe's brain pan to guess what the satchel held. The ledger, Wolfe murmured, voice low, deep. Or its contents. She attempted to discard responsibility. He became the receptacle. Now he is also the corpse. A convenience, perhaps too convenient. Saul added, I'll keep on her, but she's rattled. She knows eyes are on her. Continue, Wolfe ordered. Thank you, Mr. Panzer. Saul slipped out as silently as he'd come, and Wolfe turned those heavy eyes on me. You will bring Clara here. Without delay. She will resist. You will be persuasive. I've been called worse things than persuasive, so I headed uptown. Clara's building was guarded by a doorman who gave me the kind of look you reserve for salesmen hawking vacuum cleaners. I told him I had business with Mrs. Frobisher, official, urgent, and not the kind you keep waiting. Either my tone did the trick, or Clara had told him I was expected, because 5 minutes later, I was in her sitting room. She was dressed this time in black velvet, as if mourning were a personal brand. The gloves were gone, and in their place a cigarette dangled from her fingers, smoke curling like she'd practiced it for a stage play. You again, she said coolly. I suppose Mr. Wolfe wants more riddles answered. No, I said, he wants you. And if you don't walk into that brownstone on your own, I'll happily carry you over my shoulder. Which way do you prefer? That got me a flash of anger, quick and sharp, but she tamped it down with a drag on the cigarette. Very well. I was going to come anyway. It seems every path leads back to him. We cabbed it back, silence thick enough to slice. When we stepped into Wolfe's office, he didn't greet her, just gestured to the red leather chair opposite. She sat, crossed her legs, exhaled smoke, and waited. The ledger, Wolfe said without preamble. Her eyes narrowed. I told you. You told me you had it. You lied. It was given to Gerald Fane. Now he is dead. Your prevarication wastes my patience, madam. She stiffened, fingers tightening on the cigarette. I gave him nothing. I merely asked for his help. Wolfe's lids drooped. Pfui. You entered a banking house with a satchel. He departed. Soon after, he died with an orchid pinned to his coat. The inference is clear. She glanced at me, maybe hoping for sympathy, but all she got was a raised eyebrow. She ground the cigarette out viciously in the ashtray and said, Fine, yes, I gave him the ledger, but only for safekeeping. It frightened me. The names, the sums, it was poison. I wanted it away from me. Wolfe nodded once, slow. Then you will describe it. Now. Her voice was tight. Deposits, withdrawals, dates, years of them. Helen kept records of transactions, bribes, payoffs, even blackmail. Some of the city's most respected men are in it. Judges, bankers, politicians. It's a noose for anyone it touches. That pulled the air out of the room. Even Fritz, hovering in the doorway, made a little sound. And you thought, Wolfe said evenly, that delivering it to a wastrel like Gerald Fane would ensure its safety, or absolve you of blame. Her lips trembled, but she held her ground. I thought it would vanish with him. He knew people, unsavory ones. He could have buried it deeper than I ever could. But someone must have followed me. They wanted it, and they killed him for it. Or, Wolfe said, they killed him to frame you. Her eyes widened, then narrowed again. You think Ansel— Archie, Wolfe interrupted. Call Mr. Frobisher. Request his presence at once, and notify Inspector Kramer that his attendance is required within the hour. I got busy with the phone. Frobisher's voice cracked when I told him, but he agreed to come. Kramer barked curses, but when I mentioned the ledger, he was suddenly interested. An hour later, the office was crowded. Frobisher sat pale and twitchy, Clara stiff and regal, Kramer fuming in his chair. Wolfe presided like a judge, eyes half shut, fingers steepled. You will listen, he began, because I will not repeat myself. Helen Frobisher maintained a ledger of criminal transactions. Clara discovered it. In fear and calculation, she transferred it to Gerald Fane. He is now dead. Whoever killed him seeks not merely the ledger, but also to attach culpability to one of you. The question is which? Kramer grunted. Get to it, Wolfe. Mr. Frobisher, Wolfe said, voice like iron. Your wife's secrets. Did you know them? Ansel shook his head violently. No, I swear I didn't. Helen, she had her own world, her own dealings. I never pried. Yet you benefited, Wolfe pressed. Her comforts, her entertainments, her possessions, funded by these transactions, and when she died, you feared exposure. I feared nothing. His voice cracked like glass. Phooey. Your fear stank when you entered this room. You dissembled. You concealed. Worse, you sought refuge here, hoping to draw danger away from yourself, but the notes left with the orchids were not addressed to you alone. They were addressed to the house. To me, that was arrogance. Clara's voice cut in, sharp. Then you think he wrote them? That Ansel? No, Wolfe said softly. He has not the cunning. The author is one who knew Helen's obsession with orchids, one who could invoke that motif with precision, one who desired not only to frighten, but to unnerve me by desecrating my plants. The room went still. I glanced at Clara, then back at Wolfe. He opened his eyes fully, and the weight in them was like stone. The author, he said, was you, Mrs. Frobisher. Her breath caught, but she didn't speak. You used Gerald Fane to dispose of the ledger, Wolfe continued, but you also used him as sacrifice. You pinned the orchid to his coat yourself. You wrote the notes and planted them here, in this house, to implicate Ansel and to provoke me into entanglement. You wished to shift suspicion entirely away from yourself, but you overplayed your hand. The handwriting, slanted, restless, matches samples in your correspondence. And more damning, the orchid sliced in my plant room was cut cleanly, with a jeweler's blade. Only you, madam, wore such a diamond. Her hand twitched to her ring instinctively. That was enough for Kramer. He was on his feet, growling like a bulldog, but Wolfe lifted a hand, and he froze. You feared Helen's secrets would engulf you as well, Wolfe said. So you decided to obliterate all connection. Ansel could be discredited, the ledger lost, Fane dead. But you miscalculated. You attempted to bury rot beneath orchids. Rot, Mrs. Frobisher, does not remain buried. She rose slowly, lips parting, eyes flashing. For a moment, I thought she'd launch into a denial. Instead, she laughed, a bitter, broken sound. Then her shoulders slumped. It was supposed to end with him, she whispered. Ansel was too weak. Helen's sins would have ruined us both, I thought, if it burned with Gerald. Kramer moved in, snapped cuffs on her wrists, and read her the standard lines. Ansel sagged in his chair, pale as parchment. Clara didn't fight, didn't cry, just stared at the orchids as Fritz hovered protectively near the doorway. When the door closed behind them, Wolfe exhaled, long and slow, and reached for his beer. "Rot," he said, almost to himself. "Spreads unseen until it topples the whole stem. One must cut clean, or it devours." I leaned against the desk, watching him sip. "That's touching, but you do realize you let a woman trample through your orchid rooms just to make your point?" He glared, which was worth the price of admission. I grinned, tipped my hat, and said, "Well, at least the orchids don't write notes. Saves me from another late night chasing flowers through the city." Ansel stayed behind after Kramer dragged Clara out, which wasn't exactly by Wolfe's invitation. He was slouched on the edge of the red leather chair, his hands hanging useless, eyes fixed on the floor like it might open and swallow him. Fritz hovered near the door with the nervousness of a man who wants to clear plates but doesn't want to be caught moving at the wrong time. Wolfe had retreated to his chair, head back, lids shut, looking for all the world as if he were asleep. I knew better. Finally, Ansel croaked, She hated Helen, you know. My wife hated her with every breath. Said she made fools of us both." "Phooey," Wolfe muttered, not opening his eyes. "She hated her reflection in Helen. Envy and fear are twins. She attempted to destroy both with one act. But what happens to me now?" Ansel whispered, like a schoolboy hoping for mercy from the headmaster. "What usually happens to those who willfully blind themselves," Wolfe said. "You survive, but diminished." I could see the words land on Ansel's shoulders like bricks. He didn't argue, didn't even nod. Just sat there, staring. It was Kramer's headache now, not ours. But I had a hunch Ansel would be seeing the inside of a police station again before long, ledger or no ledger. When he finally dragged himself out, Fritz closed the door softly, as if shutting out a funeral procession. Wolfe lifted a hand for beer, and Fritz scampered to provide. I waited until Wolfe had taken a long swallow before asking, "So, are we done? Curtain falls, justice served. You go back to your orchids, and I go back to crossword puzzles." His eyes opened a fraction. "We are not done." "Why not?" Clara confessed without confessing. Kramer hauled her away, and Ansel's too busy drowning in self-pity to cause trouble. "Archie," Wolfe said, voice weighty. "The ledger?" I let out a low whistle. "Ah, the MacGuffin. You've just solved the case without the prize evidence. Kramer will notice." "He will," Wolfe said. "And he will return, but I require it first." So, back to work. That night, Saul reported in again. Clara had been intercepted by Kramer's men before she could so much as glance at her own apartment. Which meant if the ledger wasn't on Fane when he died, and Clara hadn't stashed it back home, it was floating loose somewhere between her banking house rendezvous and Riverside Park. Next morning, I followed up at the bank. The manager was a stuffed shirt in pinstripes who looked like he'd been pressed flat between ledgers himself. He denied everything, of course. No, Mrs. Frobisher had made no deposits. No, Gerald Fane had not been a client. No, they had no knowledge of satchels, ledgers or otherwise. But when I leaned in and let him know Inspector Kramer would be delighted to ask the same questions with his own breath in the man's face, the fellow crumbled enough to admit that a document case had indeed been checked into a private vault under temporary custodianship, and that it had vanished the same night, which left us right where we started, except now the ledger was missing entirely and everyone was lying about it. I brought the news back to Wolfe, who responded with the kind of groan that shakes his whole chair. "As I anticipated," he said. Clara wished to relinquish it, yet preserve leverage. She arranged its disappearance. Fane was intermediary, but someone intercepted it. "And who's our someone?" I asked. He didn't answer, not right away. He closed his eyes again, fingers steepled. "Mr. Frobisher will tell us." "Bring him." Ansel arrived that afternoon, paler, thinner, but still breathing. Wolfe wasted no time. You know where the ledger is, Wolfe said flatly. Ansel's mouth opened, then shut again. I don't... Pfui. Your wife trusted you more than she should. You pretended ignorance, but she left traces for you. Where? The silence stretched until even Fritz stopped breathing. Finally, Ansel whispered, She told me, once, that if anything ever happened, I should look to the orchids. She said the flowers would guard her secrets. Wolfe sat up an inch. Which orchids? I don't know, Ansel said helplessly. She loved them all, but she kept a locked case in her sitting room and never opened it. I was already on my feet. Give me the key. Ansel fumbled in his pocket and handed over a small brass key, trembling like it weighed a ton. I took it and headed out with Saul at my side. We entered Helen's old sitting room in the Frobisher apartment. The locked case stood near the window, dust on its glass, orchids inside drooping, but not dead. I used the key, swung the panel open, and there it was. A flat ledger book tucked beneath the roots of a potted paphiopedilum, dirt packed over the edges to hide the leather cover. Helen's twisted little sense of symbolism, guarding secrets in flowers. I brought it back wrapped in paper. Wolfe didn't so much as touch it. He just gestured for me to lay it flat on his desk. He leaned forward, eyes sharp now, and flipped the cover with one thick finger. Pages of neat script stared back, lines of names and sums and dates stretching years. Rot, Wolfe muttered. Recorded with diligence. She was a zealot. I asked, So, you handing that over to Kramer, or keeping it as your new bedtime reading? Wolfe closed the book gently. Kramer will have it, but not until I have impressed upon him the peril of possessing such filth without context. Tomorrow, Archie, we shall have our gathering, all the players here, and then the roots will be bared. I knew better than to push. He'd already locked himself into reveal mode, and once Wolfe hit that point, nothing short of an earthquake could stop him. That night, Fritz set down beef braised in Burgundy, but Wolfe barely ate. His mind was elsewhere, lines of deduction stacking in silence. I kept my own counsel, but the tension was as thick as the sauce. I knew what was coming. The big performance, Wolfe in his chair, suspects squirming, every card laid down in a fan until the killer's hand was forced, and sure enough, the next morning I was drafted to deliver summons. Clara was already in custody, but Wolfe insisted she be brought under guard. Ansel was told to present himself again, and at Wolfe's request, Kramer arranged for two of the names from the ledger, a banker and a judge, to sit in on the meeting, so Wolfe could prove his point that rot spreads to the highest branches. By evening, the brownstone was primed like a stage set. Wolfe sat in his chair, the ledger on his desk. I stationed myself near the globe stand, ready to referee if things got physical. Fritz lurked with trays, pretending not to listen. One by one, the players filed in, eyes darting to the ledger like it was a live grenade. Wolfe let them settle, then spoke with the weight of a hanging judge. Gentlemen, ladies, the orchid roots have been exposed. Tonight the truth blooms and the poison is drawn. I glanced around the room at their faces, the banker pale as milk, the judge sweating through his collar, Clara cold and silent, Ansel looking as though he wished the floor would open. Wolfe's voice rolled on, steady as thunder, and I knew we'd reached the final act. Wolfe didn't rush. He never does when he's got a room full of suspects breathing like racehorses at the starting gate. He let the silence stretch, let the air grow heavy until even Kramer shifted in his chair. Then he tapped the ledger with one thick finger. This, he said, is a record of rot. Bribes to officials, payments to intermediaries, blackmail accounts disguised as transactions. The late Helen Frobisher was meticulous. She chronicled the corruption that nourished her comforts and perhaps those of her husband. It is damning. The banker cleared his throat, a sound like a frog dying. I must protest. I've never seen that book in my life. Wolfe's lips curved faintly, which on him was the equivalent of a grin. Yet your name appears, sir, on 17 separate entries, each accompanied by dates that align with public contracts awarded through your office. I protest your protest." The judge fared no better. He tried to bluster about slander, but Wolfe cut him off with a low growl. "Pui. The ledger's authenticity will be verified by handwriting experts, bank statements, and corroborating witnesses. Your denials are wasted breath. The more interesting matter is the orchid motif, the severed blooms, the notes delivered here. They served a purpose beyond intimidation. They were confession disguised as warning." Clara sat, rigid, lips pressed thin. Kramer shot her a look that could have stripped wallpaper, but Wolfe raised a hand. "Do not presume, Inspector. Mrs. Frobisher's role we have already exposed. She sought to rid herself of danger by transferring it, but she was not the hand that killed Gerald Fane." That got the room's full attention. Clara snapped her head around, eyes blazing. "Then who?" Wolfe's gaze shifted to Ansel. He had slumped lower in his chair, but at Wolfe's words he jerked up like he'd been shocked. "No, I couldn't." "Indeed you could," Wolfe said coldly. "And you did. You wrote the notes. The slanting, impatient script was yours, not your sister-in-law's. I allowed you to believe otherwise, to watch you unravel. But the truth is as pungent as decay. You feared the ledger more than she did. You feared exposure not only of Helen's dealings, but of your own complicity. You benefited, yes, and when she died, you inherited her peril." Ansel's lips moved soundlessly, like a man drowning without water. "The orchids," Wolfe went on, voice steady, "were your wife's passion. You believed desecrating them would mask your hand, would make it appear an outsider taunted you, but your phrasing betrayed you. Roots are rotten, a metaphor Helen herself once used in correspondence I have examined. Only you, her husband, could repeat it with such intimacy. And only you knew where she had concealed the ledger, beneath the very orchids she cherished. You attempted to misdirect suspicion toward Clara, toward Gerald Fane, toward anyone but yourself." I watched Ansel crumble in slow motion, hands trembling, sweat dotting his forehead. The banker muttered under his breath. The judge cursed softly. Clara stared with something close to triumph. "You killed Gerald Fane," Wolfe said. "He became dangerous once entrusted with the ledger. You followed Clara to the bank, observed her hand it over. Later, you intercepted him. You strangled him, then pinned the orchid as message and misdirection. But murder is never a message. It is a revelation. And you revealed yourself." The room went still. Even the ticking of the wall clock seemed to hush. Then Kramer stood, looming over Ansel like a battering ram. "Well, Frobisher, care to add a confession to Wolfe's lecture, or do we just haul you in and let the DA work it over?" Ansel buried his face in his hands. His shoulders shook, and when he looked up again, his eyes were wet. "I didn't mean for it to go that far. I only wanted it gone, all of it. Gerald said he could sell it, hide it, something. But then he threatened me. Said he'd use it, bleed me dry. I couldn't." His voice cracked. "I couldn't let him?" Kramer barked. "That's close enough to a confession for me." He gestured, and the 2 uniforms he'd brought in moved forward. Ansel didn't fight as they pulled him up, clapped irons on his wrists, and marched him out. Clara leaned back, exhaling smoke she hadn't drawn. Her smile was bitter. So in the end, he was the coward. Helen would have laughed. "Silence," Wolfe rumbled. "You are not absolved. Your maneuverings compounded the peril. Be grateful you are not in chains beside him. Now be gone." She rose, stiff and furious, and stalked out with a final glance at the ledger, as though it were a corpse she wished she could bury again. Kramer picked it up, grunted. "I'll take this. DA will have a field day. Wolfe, for once, you've made my job easier instead of harder. Don't get used to it." He left with his prize and his prisoner, and at last the office was quiet again. Fritz reappeared like a ghost, gathering empty glasses with delicate hands. Wolfe eased back into his chair, closed his eyes, and exhaled deeply. "Rot," he murmured. "Always it begins in silence, unseen. And then, when left unchecked, it consumes. Orchids, men, institutions, it is all one. To prune is unpleasant, but essential." I leaned against the desk, watching him sip his beer like the world had settled back on its axis. "That's very philosophical," I said. "Personally, I just think people should stop strangling each other in parks and leaving flowers around. Keeps life simpler." He grunted, which was as close as he'd get to agreement. Fritz appeared with a tray, announcing dinner in his soft voice. The smell of beef and herbs filled the air. Wolfe opened his eyes at last, satisfied enough to rise. I followed him out, shaking my head. Another case, another pile of corpses and confessions, another night where the orchids had been dragged into the mess. I made a mental note to water my own geraniums less. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that in Wolfe's world, even flowers can get you killed. Dinner should have drawn the curtain, but Wolfe was restless, which is never a good sign. He chewed through Fritz's beef without the usual reverence, sipped his beer like it was water, and retreated to his chair before dessert. I followed with a second cup of coffee, because the way he was tapping the armrest meant he wasn't letting the night die easy. "The ledger," he said finally, "was exhaustive, yet not complete." I sat back in my own chair. "You've seen more numbers today than a tax auditor. What do you mean not complete?" He opened his eyes just enough to pin me. The structure of Helen's entries. Each line bore precision, date, name, amount. All but 3. There are gaps, Archie. Blank spaces where some should be. That is deliberate omission. Maybe she ran out of ink. Pui. His hand waved me off. Helen omitted figures because the sums were not monetary. They were in kind. I frowned. Favors, information, secrets traded for silence. Precisely. And one entry, late in the ledger, was marked only with an orchid's name. Paphiopedilum insigne. No sum, no annotation. Only that. Blinked. "That's the bloom that was smashed in our plant rooms." His lips pressed thin. Not accident, not metaphor. It was designation. That bloom signified an exchange yet unresolved. The intrusions, the mutilated flowers, all pointed to it. Frobisher killed to bury danger, but there remains a transaction outstanding. Whoever was party to it will not rest. That put a chill down my spine. So even with Frobisher in custody, we're not finished. Not until I know what that bloom purchased. The phone rang, sharp, as if on cue. I picked up, and Lon Cohen's voice came through, crisp and urgent. "Archie, tell Wolfe the Gazette's late edition is about to blow a gasket. One of our boys heard chatter down at City Hall. There's panic in a judge's chambers, documents missing, quiet inquiries about whether Helen Frobisher kept personal notes. Somebody's nervous." I jotted it down and hung up. There you have it. Somebody else wants the book to cover their tracks. Wolfe shook his head. Not the book. The flower. Helen linked that orchid with a secret potent enough to terrify men who swim in corruption daily. Tonight we locate it. I spread my hands. And how do you propose we do that? The only person who knew is dead, and the other is in custody. He closed his eyes, as though listening inward. Bring me the judge and the banker. Tonight. Now, Kramer will blow his hat. Kramer, Wolfe said firmly, will come too. Call them. Persuade them. I spent the next hour on the phone, and persuasion wasn't pretty. The judge cursed. The banker threatened. Kramer yelled enough to peel wallpaper, but eventually all 3 agreed. By 10 o'clock, the brownstone was once again a stage. Fritz standing off like a weary stagehand with beer for the star. Wolfe didn't rise. He waited until they'd all settled, until Kramer's cigar smoke coiled toward the ceiling, before speaking, Gentlemen, we are not concluded. Helen Frobisher recorded transactions, yes, but she also recorded one omission, a bloom, the Paphiopedilum insigne. You know what it purchased. Which of you will admit it? The banker paled. The judge looked away. Kramer swore under his breath. I stayed quiet, waiting for the hammer. The bloom, Wolfe went on, was a token, in exchange for a favor most full. Helen's meticulous records confirm every other exchange. This one she cloaked, for it was not to be currency, but blood. The banker's hand shook as he dabbed his forehead. I don't know what you mean. Phooey, you know precisely. Gerald Fane was an errand boy, expendable, but Helen bartered that orchid as symbol of protection. For whom? The answer lies in your silence. The judge's fist slammed the armrest. This is outrageous. On the contrary, Wolfe said, voice heavy. It is justice. One of you granted immunity to a killer. Helen traded silence for continued indulgence. That indulgence was broken when she died. Now the rot spreads. The room grew thick, sweat and smoke and nerves colliding. Finally, the banker sagged forward. It was me, he whispered. She came with papers, proof of embezzlement that could ruin me. I promised her protection, a shield from inquiries. She gave me the orchid as receipt. That was her way. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. And you destroyed the proof? Yes, but she kept her own copy. I thought it gone with her. Until now. Kramer shot up, jabbing his cigar like a bayonet. So you're admitting obstruction, bribery, God knows what else. You're cooked. The banker's face collapsed. The judge muttered curses, relieved to be spared, at least for now. Wolfe raised a hand, halting the storm. The bloom is accounted for, he said. Thus the sequence is complete. Gerald Fane died because Ansel feared the ledger. Clara schemed to shed responsibility. And you, sir, he said, turning to the banker, allowed corruption to flourish, believing flowers could mask stench, but orchids do not absolve. They reveal. Kramer cuffed the banker then and there, spitting curses as he ordered his men to haul him out. The judge slunk after them, pale and sweating. The office fell silent again, only Fritz's careful clearing of ashtrays disturbing it. Wolfe leaned back, finally at peace. There, he said, the rot cut out. At last. I exhaled, long and slow. Well, it only took stranglings, smashed orchids, a weeping widower, and a banker ready to soil himself. Not bad for 3 days' work. He ignored me, of course, reaching for his beer. Fritz set down a plate of cheese with the reverence of a priest at the altar. Wolfe selected a slice, eyes half closed, as if savoring not the food, but the order restored. I watched him, thinking how only Wolfe could turn a flower pot into a murder weapon without ever leaving his chair. Then I picked up the last note left by our anonymous orchid butcher, the one about roots rotting faster than you think, and tucked it back in my pocket. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. In Wolfe's world, roots always tell the story, and it's my job to keep pulling them up until the last one's exposed. Kramer hadn't been gone an hour when Wolfe summoned me back into the office, which meant he hadn't finished his pruning lecture. The ledger still sat open on his desk, the pages fanned like it wanted to confess more, and Wolfe was staring at it as though sheer contempt might burn it to ash. He gestured for another beer, and Fritz delivered it with the kind of look that says he'd prefer to fumigate the whole house after the company we'd just entertained. Archie, Wolfe said, the banker's confession does not satisfy. Maybe not, I said, settling in across from him, but it'll keep Kramer happy for a week, which is about as close to world peace as you're going to get. His eyes opened just enough to pin me. No, the ledger records names, transactions, sins of money and power, but a ledger cannot scheme. Someone orchestrated its concealment, its exposure, and its use as a weapon. That hand remains obscured. I leaned back. Meaning somebody's still out there, pulling strings. Just so. The orchids were desecrated not merely as metaphor, but as signature. Not Ansel, not Clara, not even the banker. They are pawns. The author is unmasked only when we ask why the ledger surfaced now. I had a few guesses, all unpleasant, but Wolfe's gaze told me to keep them to myself. He shut his eyes again, fingers steepled, humming like an idling engine. I knew better than to press, so I went to bed thinking maybe orchids weren't the only things with roots rotting. By morning, the city had a hangover. Headlines screamed about the banker's arrest, the ledger, whispers of judges and politicians sweating under their robes. Lon Cohen called twice before breakfast just to confirm Wolfe was behind it, and I told him only what would keep him writing me up as colorful instead of clueless. Around 11, Saul Panzer came by, hat in hand, calm as ever. Been following Clara since Kramer cut her loose. She's cautious, but not hiding. This morning she met a man I didn't recognize, outside a florist's of all places. They spoke, she handed him something, and he left. That woke Wolfe up faster than beer. Describe him. Tall, angular, foreign accent, German or Austrian, from the few words I heard. Neat as a pin. He bought a single orchid before leaving. Fritz nearly dropped the tray he was carrying. Wolfe's brows compressed, and he muttered something low in German that I didn't catch. Then he snapped at me. Fetch her. Clara wasn't hard to find. Saul had tailed her back to her apartment, and she didn't protest when I told her Wolfe required her presence again. If anything, she looked weary, as though playing her hand had exhausted whatever nerve she had left. She sat in Wolfe's office with her gloves back on, stiff as armor, and met his gaze with more defiance than sense. You met a man this morning, Wolfe said, voice cold. Who? An old acquaintance of Helen's, she replied. He wanted assurances. Phooey, he wanted the ledger. Did you give it to him? Her lips curled. You already have it. Why would I? Because you think yourself clever. Wolfe leaned forward an inch, which on him was a shout. You believe by dealing with him you preserve leverage. Fool, you barter with wolves, you will be devoured. She didn't answer, but her silence was admission enough. Wolfe drummed the armrest once, then looked at me. Archie, describe Saul's man to Kramer. He will trace him. Meanwhile, Mrs. Frobisher will remain here. I will not have her traipsing through the city passing poisons like bonbons. That earned me an afternoon of babysitting duty, which I did with charm and occasional sarcasm, neither of which cracked Clara's shell. She sat like stone, chain-smoking as though the smoke could hide her from Wolfe's scrutiny through the office door. By dusk, Kramer stormed in with the answer. Name's Dietrich Mahler, former attaché to some trade mission 10 years ago, now floating around in finance circles. He's dirty, no doubt about it, but slippery. We've never pinned him. Because, Wolfe said, he's parasite. He feeds on corruption but leaves no mark. He cultivated Helen Frobisher, used her ledger to ensure compliance, then let her fancy herself chronicler. When she died, he sought to reclaim his tool. Clara played into his hand. Clara snapped, "That's a lie." "Silence," Wolfe barked, and she shut up. "You met him. You handed him a duplicate. He will attempt to wield it as cudgel against those already quaking. He believes me neutralized because Frobisher is arrested and the banker disgraced. But he misjudges. Archie, you will fetch Mr. Mahler here, by persuasion if necessary. Inspector, you will provide cover." Kramer grunted. "If I bring him in, it'll be in cuffs." "No," Wolfe said flatly. "You will bring him in as guest. To accuse him prematurely is to drive him underground. I want him here, before me, to expose his hand." Kramer cursed, but agreed. 2 hours later, just past 9, the brownstone door opened again and Mahler entered. He was exactly as Saul had described. Tall, neat, angular, with eyes like cold glass. He inclined his head to Wolfe as though acknowledging an equal, then took a seat without waiting to be asked. "You have what is mine," he said, accent precise. Wolfe's lip curled. Pfui. Nothing in this house is yours. You have the ledger, Marla said. Helen's record. It was compiled for me. Return it and this matter ends quietly. Kramer bristled, but Wolfe silenced him with a look. You overreach. You manipulated Helen, yes. You used her ledger to maintain your parasites, but she did not compile it for you. She compiled it for herself, to savor her own power. Now it damns you. Mellor's smile was thin. Without it, you have nothing. It is merely ink on paper. On the contrary, Wolfe said, voice rising, it is rot exposed. The banker has confessed. Frobisher has confessed, and now you sit here, demanding its return. That is confession enough. Mellor's composure cracked. Just a hair, but it was enough. Kramer surged forward, snapping cuffs on him before he could protest. Clara let out a laugh, half hysterical, half triumphant, but Wolfe cut her short with a glare. Take him, Wolfe told Kramer. He will squeal to save himself, and the ledger will corroborate. The structure collapses. Kramer hauled Mahler out, sputtering about headlines and indictments. Clara begged Wolfe to release her, but he waved her away with contempt, and Kramer's men gladly obliged. At last, the office was empty again. Wolfe leaned back, exhaled, and shut his eyes. Rot upon rot, he said softly. Helen planted it, Clara watered it, Ansel sheltered it, the banker fed it, Mailer harvested it, and all in the end consumed by it. I stretched, bone-tired but buzzing. So that's it. Ledger in hand, villains in chains, Orchid safe again. He scowled. Safe? Orchid's Archie are never safe. They demand vigilance, as does civilization. I grinned, tipping my hat at him. Then it's a good thing you've got me around to water both. He grunted, reached for his beer, and the case was closed. Kramer's men hadn't cleared the steps before Wolfe rang for Fritz, demanded another beer, and ordered me to sit down as if I'd been pacing when in fact I hadn't budged from my chair. His eyes were still half closed, but I knew better than to think he was drifting toward slumber. The muscles around his mouth had tightened, the way they do when he's holding on to a thought that refuses to behave. The rot, he said slowly, has been excised only in part. I raised an eyebrow. Mahler's in custody, Clara's collared, Ansel's weeping into a cell, and the banker's about to be hung out to dry in tomorrow's Gazette. If that's not pruning the garden, I don't know what is. He opened his eyes enough to glare. Archie, the ledger is thorough, yet it ends 6 months before Helen's death. Why? That stopped me. You're saying she just quit bookkeeping? Decided orchids were more fun than numbers. Pfui. Helen thrived on control. If she ceased recording, it was not because she lost interest. It was because someone compelled her. The missing entries are more dangerous than those preserved. I leaned back. So now we've got ghosts of transactions we can't prove. He nodded once. But we can provoke them. The next morning, Saul dropped by with news he hadn't meant to deliver so grim. While Kramer had Mahler under wraps, Mailer had asked for counsel, and the lawyer who arrived was one of the very names in Helen's ledger. Saul swore he caught a glimpse of him leaving headquarters with a face pale as limewash. I relayed that to Wolfe, and he grunted. Good. Fear quickens tongues. By evening, the Gazette was in my hands, front page screaming about Mahler's arrest and the banker's disgrace. Buried in the second column was a quiet line. Rumors persist of additional figures named. Wolfe jabbed it with a thick finger. There. The missing months will now gnaw at them. They will seek me. He didn't have to wait long. Just past 10, the doorbell rang, and Fritz's footsteps scuffed to the vestibule. The visitor wasn't announced. He barged in with Fritz fluttering behind. A man in his 50s, expensive suit cut too sharp, face drawn as if the night itself had been chewing on him. I knew him by reputation. A contractor who'd won every city bid for a decade. He didn't sit until Wolfe gestured, and even then, he perched like the chair might sprout thorns. "You've read the ledger," he said, voice hoarse. "Yes," Wolfe replied. "Then you know—" The man stopped, swallowed. "You know what's missing. My name isn't there, but I was part of it." Wolfe lifted an eyebrow. "You confess voluntarily. Why?" "Because if you don't hear it from me, someone else will paint it worse. Mailer, he knows the missing months. He'll talk. I need—" He hesitated again, then spat it out. "I need your protection." I let out a bark of laughter. "Buddy, you came to the wrong greenhouse. Wolfe doesn't do bodyguard duty." But Wolfe's gaze had sharpened. "You fear Mailer will barter your name for leniency. You wish to preempt him." "Phooey, you're a coward, sir, but useful. Tell me precisely what Helen ceased recording." The man's hands trembled. "Property transfers. She was laundering money through real estate. Houses, blocks of apartments, whole streets. She kept notes, addresses, amounts. But not in that ledger. She had a second." Wolfe sat forward, and for him that was a jolt. "A second ledger? Where?" "I don't know," the man said desperately. "But I swear she kept one. Clara hinted at it once in anger. Said Helen had a shadow book in case the first failed." That was enough to snap Wolfe's lids open. He gestured dismissal, and the man fled like he'd been pardoned. Fritz shut the door, trembling. I turned back. "So now we're chasing another book? This case breeds more volumes than a library." Wolfe closed his eyes, but his fingers tapped the armrest. "Yes, and without it, the pruning remains incomplete." At midnight the phone rang. Kramer's growl rattled through the line. "Wolfe, Mailer cracked. He claims Helen kept duplicates. Says Clara may know where. You holding back on me?" I told him Wolfe was asleep, which was a lie, but it bought us quiet. When I hung up, Wolfe murmured, "Tomorrow, Archie." We dig. And dig we did. The next day, Saul, Ori, and Fred fanned out under Wolfe's orders. By dusk, Saul returned with the prize. A slim black book hidden in Clara's safety deposit box, registered under an alias, but traced by Saul's persistence. Wolfe flipped through it, his lips tightening with each page. "Real estate," he said. "Blocks transferred at fractions of value. Properties shifted like pawns, all to conceal flows of money. This book, more than the other, will topple structures." I couldn't resist. "And will it finally topple you into bed? Because you've been running on beer and bile for 3 days straight." He glared, but the edge had dulled. He set the book aside, reached for his beer, and let out the long sigh of a man who knows the roots have finally been pulled. But even then, I had the feeling we weren't quite done, that Wolfe was saving one last flourish for when the timing suited him. Because in his world, no ledger closes without a final reckoning. Wolfe studied the black ledger as if it had been written not in ink, but in venom. His eyes skimmed, narrowed, and then shut altogether, the way they do when he's filing details into whatever cabinet his mind keeps locked. I stayed in my chair across the desk, waiting because I knew if I said something flippant too soon he'd detonate. Finally, he exhaled, slow and heavy. "This," he said, tapping the cover with one finger, "is the marrow. Helen Frobisher's first book catalogued the disease. This one shows how it spread." I leaned forward. "Meaning what?" "Meaning she documented not merely money, but land. Whole streets transferred through shells and fronts at values absurdly low to men who had no business owning them. She recorded not just corruption, but colonization. They were carving the city into fiefdoms. That was enough to sober even me. And I'm guessing Mahler's name pops up again?" He shook his head. "No, Mahler was executioner, not beneficiary. These are men in higher towers." Before I could answer, the phone rang. Fritz brought it on a tray like it might scald him. I picked up, and Kramer's voice came through, ragged from nicotine and rage. Goodwin, tell Wolfe to quit holding out. Mailer's singing like a canary, and now we've got half the city council sweating. If Wolfe has more, I want it now. I covered the receiver. Wolfe had opened his eyes. Glinting, he nodded once. I went back on. Kramer, you'll get your bedtime story, but Wolfe wants an audience. You, Mailer, Clara, and at least 2 names from the council. Tomorrow night at the Brownstone. He swore long enough to blister paint, but he agreed. I hung up, and Wolfe settled back with the faintest curl of satisfaction. The next day was a blur of errands. I ran invitations with just enough menace in my tone to make sure the councilman didn't wriggle out. Saul shadowed Clara to ensure she didn't try another florist trick. Fritz polished silverware as if the guests were royalty instead of crooks. And Wolfe stayed put, eyes closed, working out the script he'd deliver. By evening, the office was a powder keg. Kramer barged in first, cigar blazing, followed by 2 councilmen whose faces had the waxy sheen of men already halfway guilty. Clara was brought in under guard, brittle as ever, and Mahler arrived in chains, scowling but silent. Wolfe waited until every chair was filled, then lifted the black ledger with both hands and set it squarely on the desk. "This," he said, voice carrying like a gavel, "is the end." Nobody spoke. Even Kramer held back. Wolfe went on, slow and heavy, laying it out piece by piece. Helen's first ledger had mapped the cash. Bribes, blackmail, favors. But this second book tracked the spoils. Blocks of housing transferred for pennies, businesses gutted and absorbed, land parceled into hands that now sat sweating in his office. Helen had kept it not as protection, but as pride. She'd seen herself as a gardener of corruption, tending her orchids while feeding off the rot. "And you," Wolfe said, turning his gaze on the councilman, "were her harvest. You fattened on her arrangements, secure because you believed no one would dare expose the roots. Mahler enforced, Frobisher cowered, Clara schemed, the banker dissembled. But all of you were nourished by the same decay." The judge from earlier shifted uncomfortably. One of the councilmen tried to bluster about political persecution, but Wolfe's growl cut him flat. "Pfui! The facts are inked in her own hand. Entire streets vanish from records, reappear under your names, your shell companies, your cronies, and when exposure loomed, you allowed Helen to be silenced. Her death was not natural. She was eliminated." That dropped like a stone into water. Clara stiffened, eyes wide. Mahler's face flickered, then froze again. Kramer shot me a look, one eyebrow climbing, but Wolfe didn't give him a chance. Mailer did not strangle Gerald Fane at whim. He had done it before. Helen, too, died by his hand, ordered, sanctioned to protect you. And yet you let him rot alone when his name came to light. That is the true rot. Cowards feeding on cowards. For the first time, Mahler broke. "You can prove nothing," he spat. "On the contrary," Wolfe said calmly. "The proof is in the omissions. Helen ceased writing 6 months before her death. She omitted because she no longer could. Her hand was stilled, and in the margin of her last page, faint, almost erased, is a word. Mailer. I've seen it. You will deny it. Experts will confirm it. That, combined with your proximity, your enforcement of Fane, your dealings with Clara, will suffice." Mahler lunged half out of his chair, but the guards shoved him back. Clara gasped, half triumph, half horror. The councilmen sagged like broken puppets, and Kramer, God bless him, actually let his cigar fall from his mouth. Wolfe let the silence linger, then closed the book. "There is nothing further to add. Inspector, you have your quarry. The ledger will corroborate. The city will convulse, but order requires convulsion." Kramer barked for his men, and within minutes the room emptied. Mahler struggling, Clara silent, the councilmen pale and sweating. At last it was only me, Wolfe and Fritz again. Wolfe leaned back, drained the last of his beer, and exhaled like a man finally rid of a foul odor. "Rot, Archie," he said softly. "It spreads, it consumes, it corrupts, and yet it always leaves traces. One must only be willing to dig beneath the flowers." I shook my head, standing. "Well, you've dug enough to bury half the city. Maybe next time we get a case that doesn't involve strangulations and flower pots." He glared, which was as close to laughter as he'd ever come. Fritz announced dinner, and Wolfe rose at last, lumbering toward the dining room. I followed, thinking that if orchids could talk, they'd probably hire Wolfe as their lawyer. And me? I'd just settle for a night without having to explain to the neighbors why murder keeps blooming at our address. Kramer's men had barely hauled Mahler out before the brownstone seemed to exhale, like the walls themselves were tired of housing corruption. Fritz cleared the ashtrays with the fastidiousness of a priest sweeping after a sacrifice, and Wolfe had sunk into his chair, lids closed, but I could tell from the tautness in his jaw he wasn't finished. He never is when his orchids have been dragged through the mud. I stayed put. If I'd tried sneaking upstairs, he'd have snapped me back with one word, so I figured I might as well save us both the trouble. The clock ticked, the rain hissed against the windows, and finally Wolfe said, "Archie, the storm is not concluded." "Yeah?" I said. "Looked plenty stormy to me. Kramer's got his prize villain, the council's sweating buckets, and the newspapers are already polishing the guillotine. What's left?" He opened his eyes. "Clara Frobisher." I groaned. "Haven't we wrung enough out of that woman? She's already played Judas, Joan of Arc, and Lady Macbeth in the same week." Wolfe ignored me. "She has not revealed her full knowledge. She concealed the second ledger, yes, but she knew more of Helen's affairs than she admitted. She bartered with Mahler knowingly, and there is one matter unresolved, the identity of Helen's confidant." "Confidant?" He nodded. "Helen was meticulous, obsessive, yet she wrote in codes too elaborate for herself alone. Someone assisted her. Someone versed in numbers, documents, concealment. That hand is absent from both ledgers. That absence is deliberate." I leaned forward. "So you're saying there's still another player?" "Just so. A hand clever enough to avoid even suspicion, and bold enough to let others bleed in his stead. We must draw him out." I sighed. "And how exactly do you propose to do that? We already filled this room with suspects and watched half of them crumble. Who's left?" He closed his eyes again, fingers steepling. "We shall see. Bring Clara one last time." I wasn't thrilled about the assignment, but orders were orders. By morning, I'd persuaded Kramer to release Clara for further questioning under Wolfe's supervision, which was a polite way of saying Wolfe wanted her back in the hot seat. She arrived pale, tired, but still with that brittle defiance that had become her perfume. Wolfe didn't waste breath. "Mrs. Frobisher, your sister's ledgers have unseated men who fancied themselves untouchable. But there remains another hand. Who aided her?" Clara's lips tightened. "She was clever. She needed no one." "Pfui. Clever, yes, but not omniscient. She recorded figures from sources outside her reach. Judicial contracts, sealed bank transactions. Someone fed her those." "Who?" Clara hesitated, eyes flicking toward me, then back to Wolfe. "If I tell you, what happens to me?" "You're already implicated," Wolfe said bluntly. "Your only salvation lies in candor." "Who?" Her hands trembled just a little. "It was a man called Wilton, Bernard Wilton, an accountant. He worshipped Helen, did anything she asked. She used him to trace money, to verify transactions. He thought he was her confidant. In truth, she kept him close because he was useful." Wolfe's eyes opened a sliver wider. "Where is he now?" "I don't know. He vanished after her death. I assumed—" She cut herself short. "You assumed Mahler disposed of him," Wolfe finished. "But he was too useful to discard. More likely he is still within reach. And if so, Here's the final route. I asked, "You want me to dig him up?" "Yes, quietly. Begin with the banks. His hand will be in their ledgers as surely as Helen's was in hers." That meant another day pounding pavements, which I did with my usual charm. By noon I had him. Bernard Wilton, once an accountant for a mid-level firm, dismissed after irregularities that were hushed up, now living under a false name in a rented room downtown. I brought the news back, and Wolfe's expression hardened. "Fetch him," he said. "At once." Wilton arrived that evening, courtesy of Saul Panzer's persuasive escort. He was thin, nervous, eyes darting like a rabbit's. He sat hunched in the red leather chair, wringing his hands, and blinked at Wolfe as if confronted with an idol. You've seen her work?" he stammered. "Yes," Wolfe said. "Both books, and I know you aided her." Wilton swallowed. I never meant harm. Helen wanted truth. She said the city was rotting, that she had to show it. I only gathered figures. I never knew she'd... "Pfui, you knew enough," Wolfe said. "You compiled the missing months. Where are they?" Wilton froze. His lips parted, then clamped shut. "Speak," Wolfe commanded. Wilton shook his head violently. "If I tell you, they'll kill me. They tried before. He broke off, eyes wild. For a second I thought he'd bolt, but Wolfe's voice lashed him down. "You're already dead if you remain silent. Tell me where the last record lies." Wilton shuddered, then whispered, "She gave it to me. Not in a ledger, in a single note. She said if anything happened, I was to deliver it to someone who would expose them. I still have it." My hand twitched toward my pocket. "Then cough it up." Wilton's eyes darted around the room. "It's hidden. I didn't dare carry it, but I can fetch it." Wolfe closed his eyes. "Archie will accompany you. You will retrieve it. And should you attempt deceit, he will prevent it." That was my cue, and I wasn't exactly thrilled. A nervous accountant holding the last key to the city's biggest scandal was about as safe as juggling grenades. But Wolfe had spoken, so half an hour later I was in a cab with Wilton, heading to a shabby boarding house downtown. He led me up 3 flights of creaking stairs into a narrow room that smelled of ink and mildew. From beneath a loose floorboard, he produced a folded sheet of paper, yellowed but intact. He handed it to me with trembling hands. I opened it under the dim light. One name, one sum, a date, just a single line. But it was enough to stop my breath. It wasn't a banker or a judge or even a councilman. It was bigger. I slipped it into my pocket, tightened my grip on Wilton's shoulder, and marched him back to the cab. Wolfe was waiting, upright in his chair, eyes sharp as razors when I laid the sheet before him. He read it once, then again, and leaned back, lips pressed tight. "At last," he said softly, "the final route." He read the slip again, and though Wolfe's eyes never widened, I knew the weight of what he saw had settled hard. He held the paper between thumb and forefinger as if it might stain, then laid it flat on the desk. "One man," he said, voice low, "at the pinnacle. The rest were vines, twining, feeding. This is the rootstock." I leaned closer, and though I'd already seen the name, it still carried a jolt. A mayor doesn't usually appear in murder plots, at least not in handwriting that neat. Wolfe let the silence do the work. He knew the word had hit me harder than any explanation could. "So now what?" I asked. "Do we hang it on the laundry line and watch the pigeons scatter, or do we gift it to Kramer and let him choke on it?" "Neither," Wolfe said. "First, we summon them. All who remain entangled. Kramer, Clara, Wilton, and the mayor himself. If he refuses, I will deliver this to the Gazette. He will come." That was my job. The mayor's secretary tried to stonewall, but the mention of Wolfe's name, coupled with a promise of exposure in the morning papers, had him sweating through the receiver. An hour later, the mayor's car rolled up to the brownstone under the cloak of night. Lights dimmed, guards left outside. He entered with the look of a man hoping to bargain with the devil and already doubting his odds. Kramer arrived behind him, puffing like a furnace, muttering about political earthquakes and his pension. Clara sat rigid in her chair, chain-smoking, while Wilton hunched small beside her, a shadow of his own guilt. Wolfe waited until they were all seated, then tapped the slip of paper with one blunt finger. "Gentlemen and madam, this is the conclusion. Helen Frobisher's last note. One name, one date, one sum. Paid to the mayor." The mayor's lips twisted. Baseless. Anyone could have written that. "Foy." Wolfe's voice cut through the room. "Helen wrote it in her own hand, the same as every other entry across 2 ledgers. The paper is hers, the ink is hers, the code is hers. She marked it with the Orchid's name, her signature of rot. And she entrusted it to Wilton, her confidant, to deliver should she fall." Kramer slapped the owl-eyes arm of his chair. "That's enough for me. We've got motive, we've got money, and Wolfe's got handwriting samples thicker than my case files." The mayor turned pale, then red, then pale again. "She was blackmailing me. I paid to keep her quiet. That doesn't mean I killed her." "On the contrary," Wolfe said, leaning forward now, eyes open and glinting. "You paid once, but she returned. She had found her power, and you feared she would not stop. You ordered Mailer to silence her, as you later used him to silence Gerald Fane. When Clara's meddling threatened to unearth it all, you attempted to let the rot consume her too. You orchestrated every pruning, thinking yourself gardener." The mayor gripped the arms of his chair, knuckles white. "You can't prove—" "I can," Wolfe interrupted, his voice like stone. "You left your own hand upon the root. The date on this note coincides with a transfer recorded in the city's books, buried as a redevelopment grant. Wilton supplied the figures, Helen recorded them, and you, sir, signed them." The mayor sagged, and the fight left his eyes. Clara let out a strangled laugh, sharp and hollow. Kramer stood, triumphant. "That's it. That's the nail. You're finished." Guards entered, and the mayor didn't resist. He rose like a man already buried and allowed himself to be led out. Clara stubbed out her cigarette, staring at the smoke as if it might spell her absolution. Wilton wept quietly, head bowed. When they were gone and only the 3 of us remained, Wolfe closed his eyes again. So it ends. Orchids shattered, lives uprooted. Helen Frobisher wished to expose corruption, yet she thrived within it. Her records were less crusade than indulgence. But rot cannot be curated. It consumes all. I leaned back, lighting a cigarette of my own. That's one way to put it. Another way is she dragged half the city into her greenhouse and they all choked on the fumes. And you, sitting in that chair, clipped every stem without leaving the house. He grunted, reaching for his beer. Civilization demands pruning. "Sure," I said, blowing smoke toward the ceiling. "But next time, maybe prune tomatoes. Less chance of strangulations and civic collapse." Wolfe scowled, which was victory enough for me. And with Fritz announcing dinner, the brownstone returned at last to the sound of plates and the smell of food instead of rot.